This is a bookball summary of the book Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. Why should we find time for ourselves in the fast-paced life we all live in? Why should we learn to keep calm and be collected when all hell breaks loose? Why should we learn to let go when most motivational quotes tell us to never give up? In Stillness is the Key, Ryan Holiday tries to answer these questions. The author has produced a succinct, subtle and symbolic work that will resonate with people from all walks of life. A 20-something years old, a middle-aged person or someone in the last innings of their life, from sports stars to regular shop owners, to the glittering facade of the affluent, to the content and hardworking household of the poor, this book has something for everyone. And anybody can learn to be still, even as the world rages and roars around them. So let's dive in and find out why stillness is the key. Content warning, strong language is used in Chapter 6. Number 1. Finding stillness. One day in Rome, in the 1st century CE, the powerful broker, playwright and philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca was trying to work. It wasn't easy. The noise in Seneca's environment was unrelenting. Beneath his room was a gym where athletes grunted and groaned, their weights banging and clanking. Out in the street, dogs barked and vendors shouted their wares. As though this external ruckus weren't enough, Seneca was also plagued by a cacophony of concerns. His finances were under threat, his enemies had pushed him out of political life, and he was losing favour with his patron, Emperor Nero. All in all, it was not a situation conducive to getting much done, let alone engaging in activities of intellectual value like deep thought, creativity, or decision-making. Seneca's problem, struggling to find stillness in a very unstill world, probably sounds familiar. In our time, things are even noisier. We can add loud phone conversations and cars roaring by to it. So what can you do? Seneca, for his part, found peace amid the noise by embracing stillness. So what is stillness? Have you stepped in front of an audience and poured months of practice into a single, powerful performance? That is stillness. Have you watched the slow rise of the morning sun and been warmed by the simple fact of being alive? That is stillness. Number 2. Stillness in crisis. On October 15, 1962, John F. Kennedy woke up to a dramatically changed world. While he'd been sleeping, the CIA had identified Soviet nuclear missile sites being constructed in Cuba, less than 100 miles from the Florida coast. Suddenly, what had seemed like a remote possibility was very close to home. The possibility of a nuclear attack on the United States. It was a time of immense pressure for Kennedy. If the Soviet provocation spiraled into war, a war resulted in a nuclear attack. The advice from his advisors was clear and totally instinctual. Aggression must be met with greater aggression. The missile sites had to be destroyed. But Kennedy resisted. If this approach failed, it would trigger a catastrophic nuclear war. The 13 tense days that followed have come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had Kennedy failed to maintain his equanimity, had he followed his advisor's advice, we might remember that time by a different name, the beginning of World War III, maybe. Or we might not be alive to remember it at all. Number 3. The power of presence. In 2010, at New York's Museum of Modern Art, the performance artist Marina Abramovich turned stillness into a feat of endurance. In the museum, for 750 hours across 79 days, she sat, still and silent. Across from her chair was another chair in which visitors could come and sit. More than 1,500 museum visitors sat in the chair. Each time, Marina took a moment to look down and collect herself before looking up. When she did meet the gaze of their new visitor, she was truly there, truly with them. The show was called The Artist is Present. Marina knew that if she started daydreaming or exhibiting fatigue or boredom, if she let her presentness slip in any way, it would instantly be clear to the person opposite her, so she focused solely on the present moment. Number 4. Reflect deeply. On June 12, 1942, Anne Frank wrote in her diary for the first time. She hoped she would be able to confide everything to the diary, she wrote, and that it would be a source of comfort to her. Just 24 hours later, Anne's family was forced into hiding from the Nazis. Anne continued to journal, a habit that continued to reward her with valuable insights, even under the dire circumstances in which she and her family found themselves. She discovered that writing could be a way to watch yourself as if you're a stranger, giving you a fresh perspective on your actions. How noble everyone would be, she once wrote, if at the end of the day they reviewed their behaviour. Surely we would all try to do better the following day. Number 5. Cultivate silence. Life is noisy. Phones ring, notifications beep, and many of us wear headphones on a daily basis, blocking out unwanted noise with different, more desirable noise. Sitting in an airplane with nowhere to go, you can see how much we rely on noise to avoid silence. We watch terrible movies or listen to podcasts rather than sit in silence and contemplate the terrain of our own thoughts. But why turn our minds over to distracting noise when we could instead take advantage of the great riches that silence offers us? Those riches are something that experimental music composer John Cage understood profoundly. Cage had always been fascinated by silence. In 1928, during a high school speaking competition, he even argued that the United States should establish a national day of quiet. It was the beginning of a life spent exploring what science truly means. After the performance, Cage pointed out something important. Silence, he said, doesn't really exist. What we think of as silence isn't actually silent, because it's full of accidental sounds. By giving people silence, Cage was helping them to actually start hearing. There's a lesson there for all those whose lives are too noisy. Silence, or an absence of noise, can help us to refocus and to find clarity. Number 6. Stillness of the soul. In June 2008, Tiger Woods won an 18th hole playoff to win the US Open Golf Championship for the third time. It was his 14th victory at a major, and some described it as one of the finest victories ever seen in the sport. And what's more, he did the whole thing with a leg that was broken in 2 places. It was the high point of Woods' career, but not long afterward, the golfer's world collapsed. For 21 days, the front pages of the New York Post detailed his affairs with porn stars and waitresses, as well as trysts in church parking lots and with the young daughters of family friends. His secret life exposed. Woods didn't win another major for over 10 years. As the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh had said, while the surface of the ocean may seem still, underneath there are currents. That was certainly the case for Woods, a man famous for his ability to find stillness in moments of stress who was, in fact, at the mercy of powerful riptides lurking under the surface. Number 7. Know when you have enough. Not all of John F. Kennedy's behaviour during the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated the ideas of stillness. At one point, with American and Soviet forces on the brink of conflict, Kennedy had a rendezvous with a 19-year-old student from Wheaton College at a hotel near the White House. The most powerful man in the world was being led astray by his base desires at a critical time. But before you judge too harshly, take a moment to reflect on how much you're driven by desire. Most of us fall prey to desire, whether for a beautiful person, power, the latest iPhone, or money. If we're overly driven by our desires, it becomes harder to achieve true contentment. That's because superficial desires, as opposed to those that lead to more notable pursuits, usually come at a cost. Number 8. Bask in the beauty. There's a concept in Japan called Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. It's a kind of therapy that uses nature to heal spiritual woes, not unlike, as discussed earlier, Kennedy finding stillness in the White House's Rose Garden during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, it isn't always possible to take regular forest baths ourselves. Maybe you live in the city and can't always retreat to the wilderness in search of beauty. But if we can attune ourselves to less obvious manifestations of beauty, we begin to see it everywhere. Number 9. Finding stillness in activity. Winston Churchill led a productive life. By age 26, he'd been elected to the British Parliament. He would continue to serve in government over the course of 6.5 decades. As Britain's wartime Prime Minister, he helped defeat Nazism. He also wrote over 40 books and gave more than 2,000 speeches throughout his long and prolific life. Churchill might seem like the last person from whom we would expect stillness, but in fact, he possessed it in spades. And his life was a prime example of one particular method for bringing peace and stillness to even the busiest life: taking care of yourself physically. Number 10. Make room for rest. Though Churchill discovered the joys of bricklaying at his own estate, it was in Cuba where he made arguably the most important discovery of his life. It wasn't a military strategy or a rhetorical device. No, it was the energy-giving powers of the siesta. Sure, taking care of ourselves physically means being active and finding ways to invigorate and enrich ourselves. But it's easy to focus too much on activity, as many of us do at work. It's all too common in our society to trade health for a few more hours in the office. "I'll sleep when I'm dead," say bankers, lawyers and startup founders, as they put in another grueling shift. What's your most important key takeaway? Please comment down below and share the video if you like it. Check out these other 2 videos. Thank you, and until next time.